you to imagine something simple. You're inside a massive medieval castle. The doors are closed, the torches are fading, and suddenly the light is gone. Not dim, not low, but completely gone. No electricity, no street lights. Not even the moon reaching inside those thick stone walls. Just silence, cold air, and a darkness so deep you can't even see your own hands. Now here's the question. What really happens to the human mind when it's left alone in that kind of darkness for hours? Why did even the strongest knights and nobles quietly fear the night inside their own castles? Stay with me, because tonight we're slowly stepping into that world where every sound feels closer, every shadow feels alive, and sleep comes, only if your mind lets you. And before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon in medieval times, castles, those grand symbols of power and protection, transformed into places of deep, unsettling darkness that modern minds would struggle to endure even for a single night. Unlike today's world, where a simple switch floods a room with light, medieval castles depended on rudimentary and often unreliable sources of illumination, such as candles, oil lamps, and torches, all of which were expensive, inefficient, and limited in reach. Most castles were built with defense as the top priority, not comfort, meaning their walls were thick stone, their windows were small slits designed to keep arrows out rather than let light in, and their corridors were narrow and winding, intentionally confusing to invaders but equally disorienting for those living inside. When night fell, darkness didn't gently settle. It consumed everything. Shadows stretched unnaturally across stone walls, flickering wildly with the movement of torch flames, creating the illusion of figures moving just out of sight. Even during the day, many parts of a castle, inner chambers, storage rooms, stairwells, received little to no natural light. So at night, they became completely black voids where you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Imagine trying to walk through a spiral staircase carved tightly into stone, with only a dim torch that barely lights a few steps ahead. The flame crackling and sputtering as drafts of cold air snake through the structure. Every sound, footsteps echoing, distant doors creaking, wind howling through arrow slits, would feel amplified, unnatural, and threatening. And silence itself was not comforting. It was heavy, broken unpredictably by noises that couldn't always be explained. The darkness was not just visual. It carried a psychological weight. Medieval people lived in a time deeply influenced by superstition, religion, and fear of the unknown. Without scientific understanding of many natural phenomena, darkness became a breeding ground for imagination and terror. People genuinely believed in spirits, demons, and supernatural forces that thrived at night. In a castle where corridors twisted and rooms lay hidden behind thick wooden doors, it was easy to imagine that something unseen was watching or lurking nearby. A flickering candle could suddenly dim, and that alone might be interpreted as a sign of a presence. The wind passing through narrow gaps could produce eerie whistles or low moans, echoing through halls like ghostly voices. Animals, too, added to the fear. Rats scurrying within walls, bats nesting in high rafters, and owls calling from outside could all create an atmosphere that felt alive with unseen movement. Adding to this sense of dread was the constant risk of danger that the darkness concealed. Castles were not just homes, they were military strongholds, often under threat of attack. Nighttime was the most vulnerable period, when enemies might attempt to infiltrate under the cover of darkness. Guards patrolling the walls had to rely on limited vision, straining their eyes to detect movement in the blackness beyond. Inside, the fear of intruders was ever present. A shadow could be just a servant moving quietly, or it could be an assassin. Trusting what you saw was difficult when visibility was so poor, and hesitation could be deadly. Even within the castle, accidents were common. Without proper lighting, people could easily trip on uneven stone floors, fall down staircases, or collide with unseen obstacles. Carrying a flame was necessary, but also dangerous. Fires were a constant threat, as a single overturned candle or torch could ignite wooden structures, tapestries, or bedding, potentially leading to catastrophic consequences. The architecture itself amplified the darkness. Large halls might have a central hearth or a few torches mounted on walls, but their light barely reached the high ceilings, leaving the upper spaces swallowed in shadow. Private chambers, especially those of lower-ranking inhabitants, often had minimal lighting to conserve resources. Wealthier individuals could afford more candles, but even then, the light was dim and short-lived, requiring constant replacement. Once a candle burned out, it left behind instant darkness. There was no gradual dimming like modern lights, just an abrupt plunge into blackness. In towers, where rooms were stacked vertically and connected by tight staircases, darkness could isolate people completely. If you were alone in such a space at night, every creak of the structure, caused by shifting stone or wind pressure, could feel like a deliberate movement. Hygiene and living conditions made the darkness even more oppressive. Castles often had poor ventilation and sanitation, leading to lingering smells that became more noticeable at night when visual distractions disappeared. Chamber pots were used instead of modern plumbing, and their contents might be emptied out of windows, adding to the unpleasant environment. In the dark, navigating around such hazards was difficult and often disgusting. The air could feel thick, damp, and cold, especially in stone rooms that retained chill long after sunset. Without proper bedding or insulation, nights were not only dark but physically uncomfortable, forcing people to lie awake, aware of every sound and sensation around them. Then there was the human element, the stories, the whispers, the shared fears. Castles were full of history, and often that history included violence, betrayal, and death. Tales of haunted rooms, cursed towers, and restless spirits circulated among inhabitants. Servants might refuse to enter certain areas after dark, claiming they had seen or heard something unnatural. Even if these stories were exaggerated or false, they shaped how people experienced the darkness. A person walking alone at night would not just see shadows. They would remember the story of the knight who was murdered in that very corridor, or the prisoner who died screaming in the dungeon below. The mind fills gaps in perception, and in a place where visibility is so limited, those gaps become vast and terrifying. Sleep itself was different in such an environment. Without artificial lighting to extend the day, people often went to bed earlier, but that didn't guarantee rest. Nights were long, and waking up in total darkness could be deeply disorienting. If a candle had burned out, relighting it required effort and sometimes assistance, leaving people temporarily blind in their own surroundings. Any disturbance, a sudden noise, a distant shout, or even a change in the wind, could wake multiple inhabitants, creating a ripple of anxiety through the castle. Communication in the dark was difficult, and identifying who was nearby wasn't always possible without light, adding to the sense of vulnerability. In essence, medieval castles at night were not just physically dark. They were environments where darkness intertwined with fear, uncertainty, and constant risk. The absence of reliable light turned familiar spaces into alien landscapes, where every corner could hide danger and every sound could signal something ominous. It was a world where vision was limited, imagination was powerful, and safety was never guaranteed, making the experience of night not a time of rest and peace, but one of tension, unease, and lingering dread that stretched until the first light of dawn finally broke through the narrow slits of stone walls. As the night deepened inside a medieval castle, the darkness did not remain static. It seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating, as if it had a presence of its own. The limited light sources that had once offered some comfort would gradually burn lower, their flames shrinking and flickering weakly, casting longer and more distorted shadows that crept across the stone like living things. A torch that once held steady might suddenly spit sparks or dim without warning, forcing those nearby to either replace it or accept being swallowed by darkness. And replacing a torch was no simple task. It required resources, time, and often movement through already darkened corridors, turning even a small errand into something tense and uncertain. The idea of being the one tasked to walk through those silent passageways, holding a fading flame, knowing that beyond its glow was nothing but pitch, black emptiness, was enough to make even the bravest hesitate. Temperature added another layer to the experience. Castles built of thick stone absorbed the cold as night fell, and without sunlight the interiors could become chillingly damp. The darkness seemed to carry that cold with it, making every surface feel unwelcoming. Floors were icy beneath bare feet, walls radiated a clammy chill, and even the air felt heavier to breathe. In such conditions, people often huddled close to whatever small sources of warmth and light they had, reluctant to venture away. This created pockets of dimly lit life surrounded by vast stretches of darkness, making the unlit areas feel even more ominous by contrast. Stepping away from the warmth of a fire into the surrounding blackness was like crossing an invisible boundary, from relative safety into the unknown. The design of castle interiors only intensified this feeling. Many corridors were not straight, but angled or curved, breaking the line of sight and preventing anyone from seeing what lay ahead. Doors were thick and often reinforced, and when closed, they blocked not just sound but any trace of light. This meant that even if a nearby room was lit, the corridor outside could remain completely dark. Opening a door might suddenly spill light into the hallway, creating a sharp contrast that could momentarily blind or disorient someone. Closing it again would plunge everything back into darkness, as if the light had never existed at all. This constant shift between faint illumination and total blackness kept the senses on edge. Beyond all the physical and psychological elements, What made medieval castle nights especially terrifying was how completely they stripped away any sense of control. In daylight, even a harsh and uncomfortable castle still felt understandable. Rooms had shape, corridors had direction, and people could orient themselves within the structure. But at night, that sense of order collapsed. Darkness erased boundaries. Spaces that were familiar in the day became confusing, almost maze-like, as if the castle itself had subtly changed. A turn that seemed obvious in daylight could feel uncertain in the dark, and even those who had lived there for years could find themselves hesitating, second-guessing their steps. The human reliance on vision became painfully obvious in such conditions. Without sight, every other sense tried to compensate, but not always in helpful ways. Hearing became sharper, yet also more deceptive. Sounds carried unpredictably through stone halls. What seemed like footsteps nearby might actually be coming from a distant corridor, echoing strangely off the walls. A faint knock or scrape could feel immediate and close, triggering a surge of alertness. At times, people would stop moving entirely, holding their breath just to listen, trying to determine whether a sound was real, imagined, or something worse. The inability to verify what was heard only deepened the unease. Touch, too, became a guide, but an unreliable one. Running a hand along a cold stone wall might help someone navigate. Yet it also meant confronting textures that felt unsettling in the dark, damp patches, cracks, or the sudden brush of something unexpected like a hanging cloth or a small creature. Floors were uneven, worn down over time, and without light, every step required caution. The simple act of walking became deliberate and slow, turning short distances into tense journeys. Smell often went unnoticed during the day, but became more prominent at night. Without visual distractions, the mind paid more attention to the environment, and castles were not pleasant places in that regard. The scent of smoke from torches and hearths lingered in the air, mixing with the odours of animals, food storage, waste, and damp stone. These smells, intensified in enclosed and poorly ventilated spaces, contributed to a sense of heaviness that made the darkness feel even more oppressive. It was not just that one couldn't see clearly. It was that the entire environment pressed in from all sides, engaging every sense in a way that was difficult to ignore. Isolation was another powerful factor. Even in a populated castle, night created a sense of separation. Once doors were closed and lights dimmed, individuals were often left alone in their own spaces, cut off from others by thick walls and dark corridors. Calling out for someone was not always practical or reassuring, as voices could echo strangely or fail to carry clearly. This meant that if something went wrong, a noise, a fear, a sudden illness, help was not immediately accessible. That awareness alone could make the darkness feel more threatening, as it emphasized vulnerability. There was also a constant awareness of hierarchy and restriction that extended into the night. Not everyone could move freely through a castle after dark. Certain areas might be off, limits guarded, or simply too dangerous to enter without reason. This created a sense that parts of the castle were not just dark, but forbidden. The imagination would naturally gravitate toward these unseen spaces, filling them with possibilities, hidden passages, secret meetings, or unknown dangers. The less people knew about what lay beyond certain doors or down certain corridors, the more those areas became sources of fear. Weather played its part as well. On stormy nights, the experience of being inside a castle could become even more intense. Rain would batter against the stone, wind would howl through narrow openings, and thunder would echo through the structure, making it feel as though the entire building was alive and reacting. Lightning might briefly illuminate a courtyard or a distant wall, offering a sudden stark glimpse of the outside world before plunging everything back into darkness. These brief flashes could be disorienting, revealing shapes and movements that disappeared just as quickly, leaving the mind to question what it had seen. Even the presence of other people did not always bring comfort. In low light, recognizing someone was not immediate. A figure approaching in a dim corridor could remain anonymous until they were very close, creating moments of uncertainty that could quickly turn into fear. This was particularly significant in a time when trust was not always guaranteed, and conflicts, rivalries, or hidden intentions could exist within the same walls. The darkness provided cover not just for imagined threats, but for real human actions that might otherwise be visible and preventable. Over time, people adapted to these conditions, but adaptation did not eliminate fear. It simply made it more manageable. Individuals developed habits, such as memorizing the layout of key areas, keeping light sources close at hand, or avoiding unnecessary movement at night. Still, these strategies were limited. No amount of familiarity could fully counter the unpredictability of darkness, especially in a place as complex and enclosed as a castle. What is perhaps most striking is how different this experience is from modern life. Today, darkness is often a choice. We can illuminate our surroundings almost instantly, banishing shadows with ease. But in a medieval castle, darkness was an unavoidable reality, something that arrived every evening and could not be fully controlled. It dictated behavior, shaped emotions, and influenced how people interacted with their environment and with each other. In that sense, the terror of medieval castle nights was not just about what might be hiding in the dark. It was about the complete surrender to an environment where visibility, certainty, and control were all dramatically reduced. The castle, which stood as a symbol of strength and security by day, became at night a place where those very qualities felt diminished, replaced by an atmosphere of vulnerability and unease. And as each night passed and dawn eventually returned, it did not erase that experience. It only reset it, preparing everyone within those walls to face the same enveloping darkness all over again. Another layer of fear came from how unpredictably light behaved within a medieval castle, making even the smallest flame feel unreliable. Unlike modern lighting, which is steady and consistent, a candle or torch in a stone environment reacted constantly to invisible currents of air. A hallway might seem still, yet a faint draught could cause the flame to bend, flicker violently, or dim for a moment before recovering. That brief dimming, just a second or two, was often enough to trigger unease, because in that instant shapes shifted, shadows jumped, and familiar outlines warped into something unfamiliar. The human brain, already on edge in darkness, would instinctively try to interpret these distortions, sometimes seeing figures or movement where there was none. It wasn't just darkness people feared. It was the instability of the little light they had. There was also the unsettling reality that darkness could hide ongoing activity within the castle itself. Castles were not silent places even at night. Guards changed shifts, servants moved quietly to complete late duties, and some inhabitants remained awake for various reasons. But because of the darkness, these movements were rarely visible from a distance. Instead, they were perceived as isolated sounds, footsteps echoing without a visible source, a door opening somewhere unseen, a faint murmur of voices that quickly disappeared. This created a fragmented awareness of others, where you knew people were around, but you couldn't always locate or identify them. That gap between knowing and seeing fed a subtle but constant tension. Memory played tricks as well. In darkness, the mind relied heavily on recollection, rather than direct perception. You didn't see where a table or doorway was. You remembered it. But memory is not perfect, and small errors could have unsettling consequences. Reaching out and not finding what you expected, or stepping forward and encountering something sooner or later than anticipated, disrupted that sense of certainty. Each mistake reinforced the idea that the environment could not be fully trusted at night. Over time, this created a cautious, almost hesitant way of moving and thinking, where nothing was taken for granted. There was also the presence of long unused or rarely visited parts of the castle. Many castles expanded over time, with new sections added while older ones fell out of regular use. These abandoned or less frequented areas were often left unlit and minimally maintained. During the day, they might already feel neglected, but at night, they became completely inaccessible without deliberate effort. The knowledge that such spaces existed, dark, empty, and largely unknown, added to the overall atmosphere. People might pass by a sealed door or a darkened corridor and wonder what lay beyond, their imagination filling in details that were far more vivid than reality. In some cases, the darkness also magnified social fears and personal anxieties. Disputes, suspicions, and unspoken tensions that might seem manageable during the day could feel more intense at night. Without the distractions of activity and light, thoughts became louder. A person lying awake in a dim chamber might replay conversations, worry about alliances or conflicts, or imagine scenarios that felt increasingly real in the silence. The darkness created space for introspection, but also for overthinking, where minor concerns could grow into significant fears, simply because there was nothing. One of the most deeply unsettling aspects of medieval castle nights was how easily reality and imagination began to blur, especially when the body grew tired, but the mind refused to fully rest. In such low-light conditions, the human brain tends to fill in missing visual information, and this often led to fleeting illusions. Shapes that appeared to move, shadows that seemed to breathe, or corners that felt occupied even when they were empty. A cloak hanging on a peg might resemble a person standing still. A shifting flame might make it look as though something had just passed by. These weren't deliberate fears. They were automatic responses of a mind trying to make sense of incomplete input. But in the silence and isolation of a castle at night, those small misinterpretations could feel incredibly real. There was also the phenomenon of half-sleep, where people would drift in and out of rest without ever fully relaxing. Medieval sleep patterns were often fragmented, and in the darkness of a cold stone room, it was common to wake up multiple times during the night. Each awakening came with a moment of confusion. Where am I? What time is it? What was that sound? And in total darkness, those questions had no immediate answers. The brain, still partly dreaming, could carry fragments of dreams into waking consciousness, making it difficult to distinguish between what had been imagined and what was actually happening. This created a lingering sense of unease that could persist even after fully waking. The lack of mirrors or reflective surfaces that could be used at night added to the disorientation. People could not easily confirm their own presence visually, which might sound minor, but in a pitch, black environment, even the awareness of one's own body became more abstract. Movement felt less grounded. You could hear yourself, feel yourself, but not see yourself, and that disconnect subtly altered perception. It made the environment feel less anchored, as though both the space and the self existed in a kind of suspended uncertainty. In larger castles, distance itself became a source of fear. Some chambers were located far from others, separated by multiple corridors, staircases, and heavy doors. If someone in a distant part of the castle needed help, reaching them in the dark was a daunting task. The journey itself, navigating through layers of shadow, uncertain footing, and unfamiliar sounds, could feel like moving through an entirely different world. Even if the castle was filled with people, these distances created pockets of isolation that felt complete and inescapable at night. Animals within the castle grounds contributed their own unpredictable elements. Horses in stables might shift or stomp. Suddenly dogs could bark without warning, and smaller creatures like mice or insects would move freely in the dark. These sounds were rarely visible in origin, which made them feel random and intrusive. A sudden burst of noise in an otherwise quiet environment could trigger a strong reaction, especially when there was no immediate way to identify the cause. Over time, people learned to expect such disturbances, but that didn't make them any less jarring when they occurred. Another subtle but powerful factor was how darkness affected communication. During the day, much of human interaction relies on visual cues, facial expressions, gestures, eye contact at night. Especially in dim or non-existent lighting, these cues disappeared. Conversations became more reliant on tone and words alone, and misunderstandings were more likely. A neutral statement could be interpreted as tense. A pause could feel longer than it actually was. And the inability to read someone's expression added an extra layer of uncertainty to even simple exchanges. The idea of ownership and territory within the castle also shifted at night. Spaces that belonged clearly to certain individuals or groups during the day felt less defined after dark. A hallway that was frequently used might feel unfamiliar, almost foreign, simply because it looked and felt different in low light. This created a subtle sense that the castle was not entirely under human control at night, that it had its own presence, independent of the people who lived within it. Even the act of listening to one's own thoughts became more intense. Without the distractions of daylight activity, the mind had more room to wander, and not always in comforting directions. Regrets, fears, uncertainties about the future, all of these could feel amplified in the quiet darkness. The environment didn't just allow these thoughts, it seemed to encourage them, providing a backdrop where nothing competed for attention. There was also a kind of anticipation that built as the night progressed. The middle of the night, when everything was at its darkest and quietest, often felt like a peak of tension. After that point, there was a gradual shift, a subtle awareness that dawn would eventually come. But that awareness didn't immediately bring relief. Instead, it created a contrast between what was and what was coming, making the remaining hours feel even more pronounced. People might find themselves waiting for the first hint of light, listening for early morning sounds, watching for any change in the darkness around them. In a way, the fear of medieval castle nights was not just about specific dangers or conditions. It was about the complete transformation of experience that darkness brought. It altered perception, distorted time, heightened emotion, and reduced certainty. It turned a place designed for strength and protection into one that felt fragile and unpredictable. And because this transformation happened every single night, it became a rhythm that people lived with, a cycle of light and darkness that shaped not just their environment, but their inner world as well. When morning finally arrived, it did more than illuminate the castle. It restored a sense of order. The same walls, corridors, and rooms that had felt so intimidating in the dark became understandable again, almost ordinary. But that contrast only emphasized how powerful the darkness had been, and how, for hours at a time, it had the ability to reshape reality into something far more uncertain and far more unsettling than the daylight world could ever reveal. As night stretched deeper into its quietest hours, there came a point when the castle felt almost suspended in time, as if everything inside it had slowed to a near standstill. This was often the most unnerving phase. The hours when most people were asleep, fires had burned low, and even the usual nighttime activity had faded. The castle did not become completely silent, but the sounds that remained were sparse and irregular, making them stand out more sharply. A single drip of water somewhere in the stone, the distant shifting of wood, or the faint clatter of something settling, could echo with surprising clarity. These small, isolated noises felt disproportionate, as if they carried more significance than they should, simply because there was nothing else to balance them out. In these moments, the mind became acutely aware of space, not just the space immediately around a person, but the unseen spaces beyond. Behind every wall was another room, another corridor, another layer of darkness that could not be observed directly. This created a strange awareness of being surrounded by unknowns on all sides. Even if nothing was actually happening in those hidden areas, the inability to confirm that fact left room for endless speculation. It was not just about what you could hear or feel. It was about everything you couldn't perceive at all. The structure of the castle itself contributed to this feeling of layered isolation. Thick walls, multiple floors, and enclosed rooms meant that people were often separated not just physically but perceptually. Someone might be only a few meters away, like completely unreachable in the darkness without deliberate effort. This separation created a sense that each individual existed in their own small pocket of awareness, cut off from the larger whole, the castle, which during the day functioned as a unified space, at night fragmented into countless isolated zones, each with its own atmosphere and level of darkness. There was also a subtle tension in the way darkness concealed movement over time. During the day, any change in the environment, Simone entering a room, an object being moved, a door opening, was immediately visible. At night, These changes could occur without being seen, only discovered later. A chair might be slightly out of place, a door left ajar, or an object missing from where it had been. These small inconsistencies could feel unsettling, not necessarily because they indicated danger, but because they broke the continuity of perception. They reminded people that things could happen beyond their awareness, reinforcing a sense of limited control. The experience of waiting became particularly intense in such an environment. Whether it was waiting for sleep, waiting for dawn, or simply waiting for time to pass, the darkness made every moment feel more deliberate. There were no distractions to occupy the mind fully, so attention naturally turned inward or toward the environment. This heightened awareness could make even simple sensations, like the feeling of fabric against the skin or the rhythm of breathing, seem more pronounced. While not inherently frightening, this level of awareness could become uncomfortable when combined with the uncertainty of the surroundings. Another dimension of fear came from the idea of interruption. In a place where everything was already difficult to perceive, any sudden change, a loud noise, a shout, a door slamming, felt abrupt and jarring. These interruptions broke the fragile stillness of the night, and because they were so rare, they carried a sense of urgency. As the final hours of night crept forward, there was often a peculiar stillness that felt heavier than at any other time, as if the castle itself were holding its breath. This wasn't the quiet of peace, but the quiet of suspension, when nothing seemed to move, yet everything felt poised on the edge of change. In that stillness, even the smallest internal sensations became noticeable. The sound of one's own heartbeat, the slight rustle of fabric when shifting position, the faint exhale of breath, all of it seemed louder than it should be. Without external noise to mask these details, the body itself became part of the soundscape, reinforcing the feeling of being alone within a vast, unresponsive space. The darkness during these hours also had a way of flattening perception. Depth became harder to judge, and the three-dimensional structure of the castle seemed to compress into layers of shadow. A distant wall might feel closer than it was, while a nearby object could blend so completely into the darkness that it seemed to disappear. This flattening effect made navigation even more uncertain, as the usual visual cues that helped define space were no longer reliable. People had to depend almost entirely on memory and instinct, and even those could falter under the strain of prolonged darkness. There was also an unusual sensitivity to change in light. However small, a single candle being lit in a distant room, or a door opening to reveal even a faint glow, could feel dramatic in contrast to the surrounding darkness. That small light didn't just illuminate, it transformed the atmosphere, drawing attention and subtly shifting the emotional tone of the space. People would often orient themselves towards such light sources, not just for visibility but for reassurance, as if the presence of light itself carried a sense of safety that extended beyond its physical reach. In some cases, the darkness seemed to create a kind of auditory illusion, where silence itself felt like a sound. When everything became quiet enough, the absence of noise took on a presence of its own, almost like a faint hum or pressure in the ears. This made any interruption, no matter how minor, feel sharper and more intrusive. A single footstep, a distant cough, or the creak of a hinge could cut through that silence with startling clarity, instantly drawing attention and breaking whatever fragile sense of calm had been established. Another subtle but powerful aspect was the way anticipation built without resolution. During the day, most events had a clear cause and effect. You saw something happen, and you understood it. At night, especially in darkness, that clarity was often missing. You might hear a sound, but never discover its source or sense movement without confirming it visually. These unresolved experiences lingered, leaving small questions unanswered. Over time, those unanswered moments accumulated, creating a background tension that never fully dissipated. The body's natural rhythms also played a role in shaping the experience. As the night wore on, fatigue set in, but it didn't always lead to restful sleep. Instead, it could make perception less sharp, more prone to error. Tired eyes struggled even more in low light. And the mind, worn down by hours of alertness, became more susceptible to misinterpretation. This combination, physical exhaustion and sensory uncertainty, created a state where even ordinary experiences could feel distorted or exaggerated. There was also a sense of vulnerability, tied to the idea of being observed without knowing it. In darkness, the balance between seeing and being seen shifts dramatically. Even if no one was actually watching, the inability to confirm that fact left room for doubt. The mind would occasionally entertain the possibility that something or someone could be present just beyond the edge of perception. This wasn't always a conscious fear, but rather a subtle underlying awareness that influenced how people moved and behaved. The castle's verticality added another dimension to this feeling. With multiple levels stacked above and below, darkness extended not just horizontally but vertically as well. There were rooms above you that you couldn't see, and spaces below that were completely hidden. Sounds could travel between these levels in unpredictable ways, making it difficult to determine whether something was happening above, below, or on the same level. This vertical uncertainty contributed to the sense that the environment was larger and more complex than could be fully understood in the dark. In moments of prolonged stillness, time itself seemed almost to pause. Without clear markers to indicate its passage, minutes could stretch into what felt like much longer periods. People might find themselves wondering how much of the night remained, yet having no reliable way to measure it. This uncertainty made the wait for dawn feel indefinite, as though the night could continue indefinitely without resolution. And yet, just before morning, there was often a subtle shift that could be felt even before it was seen. The quality of the darkness began to change. Not lighter in a visible sense at first, but somehow less dense, less absolute. The air might feel slightly different, sounds might carry in a new way, and there was a faint sense that the environment was beginning to open up again. This transition was gradual, almost imperceptible, but it marked the beginning of the end of the night's hold. When the first true light finally appeared, it did more than illuminate. It restored coherence. The castle's structure became visible again. Distances made sense, and the countless uncertainties of the night dissolved almost instantly. What had felt vast and unknowable shrank back into something familiar and manageable. But the memory of that darkness, of how completely it had altered perception, heightened awareness, and introduced doubt, remained. Ultimately, the terror of medieval castle nights was not rooted in constant danger, but in the way darkness transformed experience itself. It removed certainty, amplified sensation, and created a space where the mind had to work harder to interpret reality. In doing so, it revealed just how fragile human perception can be when stripped of light, and how even the strongest, most fortified structures could become places of quiet unease when night fell and the world beyond sight took over. Even after everything the night imposed, its silence, its distortions, its quiet pressure, there was still another layer that made medieval castle darkness uniquely unsettling. The sense that nothing could ever be fully verified until morning. In daylight, certainty came easily. You could look, confirm, and move on. But at night, especially within thick stone walls and dim corridors, certainty was always delayed. You might think you heard something, but you couldn't prove it. You might feel a presence, but you couldn't see it. You might notice a change, but you had no way of knowing when or how it happened. This constant postponement of clarity created a lingering tension that never quite resolved itself. That lack of immediate verification changed how people trusted their own senses. Doubt became part of perception. Instead of simply reacting to what they experienced, individuals had to question it. Was that real, or was it just the wind or imagination or memory interfering? This internal questioning added an extra layer of mental effort, making even simple awareness more complex. Over time, it created a subtle fatigue, not just of the body, but of the mind constantly trying to interpret incomplete information. There was also the strange way darkness made space feel shared, even when it wasn't. In total or near total darkness, the boundaries between objects, rooms, and even individuals seemed to dissolve. Without clear edges or outlines, everything blended into a single, continuous field of shadow. This could give the impression that the space around you was occupied in a more general sense, rather than divided into distinct areas. It wasn't that you believed someone was there. It was that the environment no longer clearly told you who or what wasn't there. In long corridors or large halls, this effect became even more pronounced. A person standing alone in such a space might feel as though the darkness extended endlessly, even if they knew the physical limits of the room. The far end of the hall, invisible in the blackness, could feel infinitely distant, creating a subtle disconnect between knowledge and perception. You knew the walls were there, but without seeing them, they felt uncertain, almost theoretical. The concept of direction also became less stable. In well-lit conditions, orientation is automatic. You know where you are facing, where you came from, and where you are going. In darkness, especially when moving slowly or hesitantly, that sense of direction could blur. A slight turn or misstep could leave someone unsure of their exact position or heading, particularly in complex parts of the castle. This disorientation didn't have to be dramatic to be effective. Even a small uncertainty could make movement feel less confident and more cautious. Another subtle influence was how darkness affected expectations. During the day, people expected to see things clearly, and those expectations were usually met. At night, expectations shifted. People anticipated difficulty, uncertainty, and potential surprise. This anticipation changed how they experienced even neutral situations. A quiet corridor wasn't just quiet, it was potentially hiding something. An empty room wasn't just empty, it was unconfirmed. This shift in expectation meant that the mind was always slightly ahead of reality, preparing for possibilities that might never occur. There was also a kind of emotional echo that carried through the night. Even beyond all of this, there is one last almost invisible layer to the experience of medieval castle nights. The way darkness slowly reshaped a person's relationship with certainty, until even the idea of knowing something felt temporary. In daylight, knowledge feels stable. You see a door. You know where it is. You see a person. You recognize them. But at night, especially in the near, total darkness of a castle, knowledge becomes conditional. You know something only as long as you can remember it. The night because you can currently see it. And memory, unlike sight, can waver. This created a subtle but constant tension between what was remembered and what was actually present in the moment. You might walk through a corridor relying entirely on memory, counting steps, recalling turns. But there was always a small doubt. What if something has changed? What if something is different tonight? Even if nothing ever did change, the possibility alone was enough to keep the mind from fully relaxing. Certainty became something you carried inside, rather than something confirmed by the world around you. There was also a strange sense of detachment that could emerge in prolonged darkness. Without visual anchors, the connection between a person and their surroundings became less immediate. You existed in the space, but the space did not fully reveal itself to you. This could create a feeling that was difficult to describe, like being present but not fully grounded, as though part of your awareness was always searching for confirmation that never quite arrived. In these conditions, even simple decisions took on a different weight. Choosing to move, to stay still, to light a candle, or to let it burn out. These were not just practical choices, but responses to uncertainty. Each decision carried a small risk, not necessarily of danger, but of discomfort or disorientation. Over time, this made people more deliberate, more measured in their actions, as if every movement needed to be justified in a way it wouldn't during the day. There was also the quiet influence of repetition. Experiencing the same darkness every night didn't eliminate its effects. It normalized them. People became accustomed to uncertainty, to limited perception, to the constant need for interpretation. But normalization is not the same as comfort. It meant that the unease became a background condition. Something always present, but not always consciously noticed. Like a faint pressure, it shaped behavior without demanding attention. In some moments, this background unease could surface more clearly, especially when something disrupted the expected pattern. A sound that didn't fit, a shadow that moved differently, a feeling that couldn't be immediately explained. These moments stood out sharply, breaking through the normalized experience of darkness. And because the mind was already operating with limited information, these disruptions could feel more significant than they might in daylight. There was also a subtle awareness of dependence on light, on memory, on routine. In a medieval castle at night, independence was limited by the environment. You could not fully rely on your senses alone. You needed tools, habits, and familiarity to function effectively. This awareness reinforced a sense of vulnerability. not in a dramatic or immediate way, but as a quiet acknowledgement of limitation. And yet, within that limitation, there was also a kind of heightened presence. Without the distractions of visual detail, attention often narrowed to what could be perceived, sounds, textures, internal thoughts. This focus could make experiences feel more intense, more immediate. A single sound could hold your full attention. A small movement could feel significant. The world became simpler in some ways, but also more concentrated. As the night continued, this concentration could either deepen into calm or sharpen into unease, depending on the person and the moment. Some might find a strange stillness in it, a kind of quiet acceptance of the environment. Others might feel the weight of uncertainty more strongly, especially when combined with fatigue or lingering thoughts. And when the first signs of morning finally began to appear, the transition was not just physical but psychological. The return of light didn't just reveal the environment, it restored trust. Suddenly, what you saw aligned with what you knew. Memory and perception matched again. The need for constant interpretation faded, replaced by direct understanding. But that restoration also highlighted everything that had been missing during the night. It made clear how much effort had been required to function in darkness, how much of the experience had depended on guesswork and adaptation. The contrast was not just noticeable, it was profound. In the end, the deepest reason medieval castles were so terrifyingly dark at night lies in this gradual erosion and rebuilding of certainty. Darkness didn't just hide the physical world, it changed how people related to it. It turned knowledge into memory, perception into interpretation, and presence into something that had to be continuously reaffirmed. Night after night, this cycle repeated. Light brought clarity, darkness took it away, and people lived within that rhythm, adapting to it but never fully escaping its effects. And in that repetition, the darkness became more than just a lack of light. It became a defining part of existence, a condition that revealed not only the limits of the environment, but the limits of human perception itself. And even after all of these layers, there remains one final, deeply subtle aspect that made medieval castle nights so unsettling: the way darkness quietly dissolved the sense of continuity between moments, making experience feel fragmented rather than flowing. In daylight, time feels connected. One moment leads naturally into the next, guided by sight, activity, and clear awareness. But in the darkness of a castle, that continuity could break down. Each moment felt more isolated, as if it existed on its own, with only memory linking it to what came before. You might take a few steps through a corridor, pause, listen, and then move again. But each of those actions felt separate, almost disconnected, because there was no continuous visual field tying them together. The mind had to repeatedly re-anchor itself. Where am I? What am I doing? What comes next? This constant reorientation, though subtle, created a sense that experience itself was less stable, less fluid. There was also the peculiar sensation of incomplete presence. You were physically there, fully within the castle, yet your awareness of that presence was partial. You could feel the ground beneath you, hear your surroundings, but without sight, your understanding of the space remained unfinished. It was as if you were only experiencing a portion of reality at any given moment, with the rest hidden just beyond reach. That incompleteness wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and impossible to fully resolve until morning. This led to a kind of mental looping, where the same thoughts or observations would repeat more frequently. Without new visual input to refresh attention, the mind often circled back to the same points. Listening again for a sound, reconsidering a memory, re-evaluating a shadow. These loops weren't necessarily intense, but they contributed to a feeling that time was not moving forward as clearly as it should. Another layer came from the way darkness reduced feedback from the environment. During the day, actions produce immediate, visible results. You move, and you see the change, you look, and you confirm what's there. At night, that feedback was limited or absent. You might move through a space without fully seeing it change around you, making your actions feel less grounded. This lack of feedback could create a slight disconnect between intention and experience, where actions felt less certain, less complete. There was also a quiet awareness of dependence on others, even when alone in such an environment. The presence of other people, even if distant, carried a certain reassurance. But at night, that presence was often abstract. You knew others were somewhere within the castle, but you couldn't see or easily reach them. This created a paradoxical feeling of being both surrounded and alone at the same time. The darkness also altered the sense of scale, not just physically, but emotionally. Small spaces could feel larger because their boundaries were unseen, while large spaces could feel enclosing because their openness was invisible. This shifting sense of scale made the environment feel less predictable, as if its size and shape could not be fully trusted. Even familiarity itself became something that needed to be actively maintained. It wasn't enough to have known a place during the day. You had to refamiliarize yourself with it at night, through memory and cautious movement. This process of refamiliarization was ongoing, repeated each evening, reinforcing the idea that knowledge of a place was not permanent, but situational. There was also a subtle tension between stillness and expectation. The castle at night could be incredibly still, yet that very stillness made any potential change feel more significant. The absence of activity didn't remove the possibility of it. It highlighted it. This created a quiet readiness, a sense that something could happen at any moment, even if nothing ever did. And perhaps most quietly of all, darkness changed the way people related to the unknown, not as something distant or abstract, but as something immediate and surrounding. In daylight, the unknown exists beyond what you can see, in distant places, behind closed doors. At night, the unknown exists right where you are, in the very space you occupy, because you cannot fully perceive it. This proximity made the unknown feel more present, more integrated into every day. And even after all of this, there is still one final, almost imperceptible dimension to the darkness of medieval castle nights. The way it slowly reshaped a person's sense of self within the environment. In daylight, identity feels stable and anchored. You see your surroundings, you see others, and through that you understand your place in the world. But in the deep darkness of a castle, that anchoring weakens. Without clear visual reference points, your sense of where you are becomes less precise, and with it, your sense of how you exist within that space begins to shift. You are still there, of course, but the experience of being there becomes more internal than external. Instead of being defined by what you see around you, your awareness turns inward, guided by sensation, memory, and thought. This creates a subtle inward pull, where the boundary between the outer world and inner perception becomes less distinct. The castle still surrounds you, but it is no longer fully visible. It becomes something you carry mentally as much as something you physically inhabit. This inward shift could make solitude feel deeper than it actually was. Even if dozens or hundreds of people were within the same structure, the darkness created a kind of experiential isolation, where each person's awareness was largely confined to their immediate surroundings and internal state. You weren't just alone in a physical sense, you were alone in perception, navigating your own version of the night. There was also a quiet instability in how presence was felt over time. In a well-lit environment, presence is continuous. You remain aware of yourself and your surroundings in a steady way. But in darkness, that awareness could fluctuate. Attention might drift, sharpen suddenly, then soften again. Moments of clarity would alternate with moments of uncertainty, creating a rhythm that felt less consistent, less anchored. This fluctuation extended to emotional tone as well. Without clear external input to stabilize mood, feelings could shift more easily. A neutral state could become uneasy without a clear cause, or a moment of calm could feel unexpectedly fragile. The environment didn't dictate emotion directly, but it removed many of the anchors that normally keep emotions steady, allowing subtle changes to become more noticeable. Another deeply subtle effect was how darkness altered the sense of distance from oneself. In daylight, actions feel immediate and directly connected. You move, you see it happen, and the experience is unified. In darkness, that connection can feel slightly delayed or indirect. You act, but the confirmation of that action is limited, creating a small gap between intention and perception. Over time, this can make experience feel just slightly removed, as if there's a thin layer between you and the world. There was also a quiet awareness of vulnerability that extended beyond physical safety. It was not just about the possibility of danger, but about the recognition that your understanding of the world was incomplete. You could not fully see, fully confirm, or fully control your surroundings. This awareness wasn't always conscious, but it was present, shaping how people moved, thought, and felt. In long stretches of stillness, this could lead to a kind of heightened introspection. With fewer external distractions, the mind naturally turned inward, examining thoughts, memories, and questions with greater intensity. This introspection wasn't necessarily negative, but in the context of darkness and uncertainty, it could take on a heavier tone, making thoughts feel more significant, more immediate. There was also the subtle way darkness disrupted the sense of shared reality. During the day, people experience the same environment in largely the same way. What is visible to one is visible to all. At night, that shared experience fragments. Each person sees only what their light allows, hears only what reaches them, and interprets it through their own state of mind. Reality becomes more individual, less collective. And within that individuality, imagination gained more influence, not in a dramatic or fantastical sense, but in small, quiet ways, filling in unseen spaces, interpreting ambiguous sounds, shaping expectations. Imagination didn't replace reality, but it intertwined with it, becoming part of how reality was experienced in the absence of clear information. As the night continued, this blend of perception and imagination created a world that felt both real and slightly uncertain, grounded yet incomplete. It wasn't chaotic. It had its own internal logic, but that logic depended heavily on interpretation rather than direct observation. Then, as dawn approached, something shifted once again. The gradual return of light didn't just restore visibility. It reconnected the inner and outer worlds. What had been imagined could now be seen. What had been uncertain could be confirmed, and what had been internal could once again align with the external environment. This reconnection brought a sense of relief that was deeper than simple comfort. It was the relief of coherence, the feeling that everything made sense again. That perception matched reality without effort. But that relief also revealed how profound the night's transformation had been. It showed that darkness had not merely hidden the castle. It had changed the way people experienced themselves within it. It had turned awareness inward, fragmented perception, and introduced a constant need for interpretation. And so, in the end, the true terror of medieval castle nights was not just in the shadows or the silence, but in this quiet reshaping of experience itself. It was in the way darkness altered not only what people could see, but how they existed, how they understood, and how they felt within the world around them. Night after night, this transformation repeated, subtle, persistent, unavoidable, until it became part of life itself. And within those thick stone walls, where light was scarce and darkness was absolute, that transformation was not just an occasional discomfort, but a defining reality of existence, one that returned with every sunset and only faded, temporarily, with the fragile, returning light of dawn. And even after all these layers, there is still one last, almost intangible dimension to the darkness of medieval castle nights. The way it subtly disrupted the feeling of continuity between the outer world and inner awareness, making existence feel slightly unanchored. In daylight, there is a constant alignment between what you perceive and what you understand. You look, and the world confirms itself. But in the deep darkness of a castle, that alignment weakens. The world does not confirm itself as readily, and so your awareness must stretch to fill in the gaps. This stretching creates a quiet tension, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but persistent. It's the feeling of maintaining connection with something that isn't fully present to your senses. You know the walls are there, the corridors extend, the rooms exist, but you are not actively seeing them. So your mind holds on to them in a kind of suspended awareness, like a map kept alive without direct reference. That act of holding, of mentally sustaining the structure of the world, becomes part of the experience of the night. There is also a subtle thinning of certainty about now. In daylight, the present moment feels immediate and complete. At night, especially in darkness, the present can feel slightly delayed or muted, because you are always interpreting rather than directly perceiving. It's as if the moment you're in is filtered through memory and expectation before it becomes fully real. This doesn't stop you from functioning, but it adds a layer of distance to experience. This distance can make even stillness feel active. When you sit or lie in the dark, you are not simply resting. You are listening, sensing, interpreting. The mind remains engaged even in quiet moments because it cannot rely on passive observation. Every sensation becomes a point of focus, every sound a signal to be understood. Rest, therefore, is never entirely complete. It is always accompanied by a degree of awareness. There is also the curious way darkness reshapes anticipation. During the day, anticipation is often tied to visible events. You see something approaching, you prepare for it. At night, anticipation becomes more abstract. You anticipate without clear cause, simply because the environment allows for possibilities that cannot be ruled out. This creates a low, continuous readiness, a state of being prepared without knowing for what. In long corridors or open halls, this anticipation can feel almost spatial, as though it exists within the darkness itself. The unseen areas seem to hold potential, not in a specific way, but as a general sense that something could emerge from them at any time. Even if nothing ever does, the possibility remains present, woven into the experience of the space. There is also a subtle shift in how people relate to silence. In daylight, silence is often neutral or even calming. In the darkness of a castle, silence can feel more ambiguous. Without visual confirmation, silence does not necessarily mean absence. It could simply mean that nothing is currently detectable. This ambiguity gives silence a different quality, one that feels less definitive and more open-ended. Over time, this changes how silence is experienced. It becomes something to listen into, rather than something to simply exist within. People become attuned to its nuances, the way it deepens, breaks, or shifts. And these changes take on meaning, even if that meaning is uncertain. There is also a subtle awareness of the limits of reach. In darkness, your affective world shrinks to what you can touch, hear, or faintly see. Beyond that, everything exists at a remove outside immediate interaction. And even after all these layers, there is still one final, almost imperceptible truth about medieval castle nights. The way darkness quietly dissolved the feeling of assurance itself, leaving behind a world that could be experienced, but never fully settled into. In daylight, there is an ease to existence. You move, you see, you understand, and that understanding holds steady. But in the deep, unbroken darkness of a castle, that steadiness slips away. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, like something loosening its grip. You could still function, still navigate, still think clearly, but beneath all of that, there was a faint instability, a sense that nothing was entirely confirmed in the present moment. Every perception carried a small degree of uncertainty, and that uncertainty never fully disappeared. It didn't stop action. It accompanied it. This created a subtle shift in how reality was trusted. During the day, trust in the environment is automatic. You rarely question what you see. At night, that trust becomes conditional. You rely on your senses, but you also remain aware that they are limited. That awareness becomes part of perception itself, so that every experience contains both recognition and doubt at the same time. There was also a quiet thinning of immediacy. In light, the world feels directly present. You are immersed in it. In darkness, the world feels slightly removed, as though it exists just beyond full reach. You interact with it, but you do not fully grasp it in the same way. This creates a kind of distance, not physical, but experiential, where everything feels just a fraction less solid, less immediate. In long stretches of stillness, this distance could deepen into a kind of suspended awareness. You are present, alert, conscious, but the environment does not fully respond to your presence. It does not reveal itself, does not confirm itself. It simply exists around you, partially hidden, partially known. This lack of response makes the world feel quieter, but also less anchored. There is also the peculiar way darkness changes the meaning of nothing happening. In daylight, if nothing happens, it feels neutral. In darkness, nothing happening can feel incomplete, as though it might only appear that way because you cannot fully perceive what is there. This turns stillness into something ambiguous, not peaceful, not threatening, but unresolved. Over time, this unresolved quality becomes part of the background of experience. It does not demand attention, but it shapes how everything is felt. Movements become slightly more deliberate, pauses slightly longer, attention slightly more focused. Even rest carries a faint layer of awareness, as if the mind never fully disengages from the need to interpret. There is also a subtle sense of holding oneself together within the environment. In daylight, the world supports your awareness. You see where you are, and that stabilizes your sense of self. In darkness, that support is reduced, so awareness becomes more self-contained. You rely more on your internal sense of position, of orientation, of existence. It's not that you lose yourself, but that you must actively maintain your connection to the world around you. This creates a quiet effort that runs beneath everything else. Not effort in the physical sense, but in the sense of maintaining coherence, keeping your understanding of space, time, and presence aligned without full sensory confirmation. It is subtle, constant, and largely unnoticed, yet it defines the experience of the night. There is also the strange way darkness reshapes expectation of the future, even in small moments. In daylight, the next moment feels predictable. You expect continuity. In darkness, the next moment feels slightly open. Ended not because something will necessarily happen, but because you cannot fully anticipate what you will perceive. This gives time a slightly different texture, less certain, more provisional. As the night deepens, all of these effects overlap and blend, creating an experience that is not defined by fear alone, but by a persistent incompleteness. The world is there, but not fully accessible. You are there, but not fully grounded in what you can perceive. Everything functions, but nothing feels entirely resolved. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, dawn begins to undo all of this. Light returns, not just as illumination, but as confirmation. The world begins to answer again. Walls appear where you knew they were, spaces align with memory. Distance becomes measurable, and perception reconnects with reality without effort. This reconnection is immediate and profound. The need to interpret fades, the quiet tension dissolves, and the environment once again feels stable, responsive, complete. It is not just easier to see, it is easier to be. But that contrast reveals the true depth of what the night had done. It shows that darkness had not simply hidden the castle. It had transformed the experience of existence within it. It had introduced uncertainty into every moment, reduced immediacy, and required constant, subtle effort to maintain coherence between self and surroundings. And so, in the end, the deepest reason medieval castles were so terrifyingly dark at night is not just because they lacked light, but because that absence reshaped reality itself. It created a world where nothing could be fully settled, where perception was always partial, and where existence required a quiet, continuous act of understanding. Night after night, this transformation returned, steady, unavoidable, woven into the rhythm of life, until it became an unspoken truth for those who lived within those stone walls, that when the light faded, the world did not disappear, but it became something else entirely, less certain, less immediate, and far more dependent on the fragile, human effort to make sense of it until morning came again. And even beyond all of this, there is still one final, almost indescribable layer to the darkness of medieval castle nights. The way it slowly dissolved the feeling of completeness, leaving behind an experience that was always slightly unfinished, as if something essential was missing but never fully identifiable. In daylight, the world feels whole. Every space, every object, every movement connects seamlessly into a complete picture. But in the deep darkness of a castle, that completeness fragments. You are never experiencing the whole, only parts, glimpses, suggestions. This creates a quiet but persistent sense that reality itself is incomplete. You might be standing in a room, but you are only aware of fragments of it. The faint outline of a wall, the edge of a doorway, the glow of a dying flame. Everything else exists beyond perception, not absent, but inaccessible. And because so much of the environment remains hidden, the mind is constantly aware that what it perceives is only a fraction of what is actually there. That awareness subtly changes how every moment feels. Nothing is fully resolved. You don't just experience a space, you approximate it. You don't fully observe, you infer. And this constant reliance on inference means that certainty is never absolute. It is always provisional, always open to revision. There is also a quiet disruption in how continuity is experienced across space. In daylight, you can visually connect one part of a room to another, one corridor to the next. That connection creates a sense of flow, of uninterrupted structure. In darkness, those connections break. Each visible or perceptible area feels like an isolated fragment, disconnected from the rest. Moving from one place to another is not just physical, it is a transition between pockets of partial awareness. This fragmentation makes even familiar environments feel subtly unfamiliar, not because they have changed, but because they can no longer be perceived as a whole. The castle becomes less like a single structure and more like a series of separate, loosely connected experiences. There is also a peculiar way in which darkness alters the sense of arrival. In daylight, when you reach a destination, a room, a doorway, a staircase. You know you have arrived because you can see it clearly. In darkness, arrival is less definitive. You may feel that you've reached the right place, but without full visual confirmation, that feeling remains slightly uncertain, even being there does not carry the same sense of completion. This lack of clear arrival contributes to a broader sense of incompleteness that runs through the entire night. Actions begin and end, but they don't always feel fully closed or resolved. Each moment carries a faint residue of uncertainty, as if it hasn't entirely settled into the past. There is also the quiet way darkness reshapes the perception of boundaries. Walls, doors, and objects still exist, but without clear visibility, their edges soften. Boundaries become less distinct, more conceptual than concrete. You know where something should be, but you don't always perceive it directly. This creates a subtle ambiguity in how space is experienced, less defined, more fluid. In such an environment, the mind becomes a kind of bridge between what is known and what is perceived. It continuously fills gaps, reconstructs spaces, and maintains coherence. But this process is never perfect. It is influenced by memory, expectation, and emotion, which means that the experienced world can shift slightly from moment to moment. There is also a quiet awareness of effort in maintaining this coherence. It is not a conscious effort, but it is present. A background process that keeps perception and understanding aligned as much as possible. Over time, this effort contributes to a sense of fatigue that is not purely physical, but cognitive, arising from the need to constantly interpret incomplete information. And even beyond this persistent sense of incompleteness, there was one final, deeply quiet transformation that darkness imposed on medieval castle life. The way it altered the feeling of certainty over existence from moment to moment, making even the simplest experience feel slightly provisional, as though it had not yet fully settled into reality. In daylight, existence feels continuous and self-evident. You are where you are, things are where they appear to be, and each moment carries forward with a natural sense of confirmation. But in the depth of castle darkness, that confirmation weakens, not because anything disappears, but because nothing is fully verified as you experience it. Each moment exists, but it feels as though it needs to be constantly reaffirmed through attention, memory, and interpretation. This creates a subtle but constant sense of checking. You are not consciously verifying everything, but your awareness carries a quiet need to ensure that what you think is happening aligns with what little you can perceive. That process is never fully complete. It continues in the background, shaping how the night is experienced. There is also a peculiar thinning of permanence. During the day, objects and spaces feel stable. They remain where they are, visibly unchanged. At night, permanence becomes something you assume rather than observe. A chair is where you remember it being. A doorway is where you expect it to be. But without seeing them, their presence feels slightly less solid. Not absent, not